my name is Adolfo Sanchez Blanco and I'm one of the biology professors at Capital Community College. In this series of videos, we are talking about various scientific insights into COVID-19. In this video in particular, we are talking about how we can prevent the spread of the virus, how we can avoid getting infected. All right, so far we have more or less completed the first wave of infections. We have passed the worst part of the infection so far thanks to the containment efforts, and we are somehow around here on the infections curve, all right, since the outbreak started. At this point, approximately in the state of Connecticut, as of beginning of June, the end of May, we have about 13% of the entire population of the state of Connecticut that has been already infected with the virus. Unfortunately, what this means is that there is still about 87% of the population of the state that can be infected by the virus still. All right, so what we need to do is to avoid potential new infections if we want to avoid potential new outbreaks, because outbreaks are really more than possible. We could say that they are likely to happen. All right, so how can we prevent new outbreaks? Well, we can prevent new outbreaks by preventing the spread of the virus. Basically, as I was saying before, we are more or less around here. We have passed this first curve of infections and we are finishing this first curve of infections. So what we should try to do is to control the virus infections now that we have been able to bring them at a relatively low level, and we should be doing so basically indefinitely, gaining time until a vaccine is available. All right, so if we want to prevent infections, the very first thing that we need to do is to understand how infections happen. All right, and what we need to understand is that the main way that the virus that produces COVID-19, which is called the SARS-CoV-2 virus, is shed from people that are infected. And what we need to understand is that the way this virus is shed is going to be primarily via these tiny microscopic respiratory droplets that we produce every time that we talk, every time that we breathe, every time that we cough, every time that we sneeze, etc., etc. All right, so these tiny droplets that we generate even as we breathe have various sizes. All right, some of them are a little bit larger, some of them are kind of like in between, some of them are super microscopic. All right, all of them are very, 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 very tiny and very difficult to see with the naked eye. Some of them impossible to see with the naked eye because they are really microscopic. But it is in these tiny respiratory droplets that the virus travels. All right, that the virus is going to be shed. So it appears as if the virus tends to like those slightly larger or mid-size droplets, respiratory droplets that we generate when we talk or breathe, etc. Right? However, there are some evidence out there that indicate that the virus can effectively also travel in these much smaller respiratory droplets that are able to spread in especially an enclosed room throughout a longer distance. All right, those are normally what they are called aerosols. So anyway, when a person is infected, by this person talking and breathing and coughing and doing all those other activities that I was saying before, is going to generate a cloud of respiratory droplets, as we can see in here, and in those respiratory droplets there are going to be viruses. All right, the virus that produces the COVID-19. So if people come into contact with that respiratory cloud of droplets, that's when, by inhalation of those tiny respiratory droplets, somebody else can get infected. All right, so this is the very first thing that we need to keep into consideration. Now, understanding the biology of the transmission of the virus, we can now break down the major categories of, or the major sources that lead to infection with the virus that produces COVID-19. All right, so understanding the major sources of COVID-19 infection is very useful for us to focus on specific targeted ways in preventing these major sources of infection. Let's start with this one, with the one that actually is supposed to be the least significant of all the other sources, right? And this is through infected surfaces. What do we mean by this? Well, it is estimated that certain scientific research has been done that estimates that about 10% of all the infections that led to COVID-19 were due to infected surfaces, people touching those infected surfaces and then contaminating themselves. All right, where are these infected sources coming? Well, if somebody is infected with the virus, either knowingly or unknowingly, if somebody is infected, somebody is going to shed the virus via those respiratory droplets that we were talking about before. And then those respiratory droplets can travel and hit whatever type of surface that this person was, for example, breathing towards or talking towards, etc. And when this happens, those particles, those viral particles, are going to stay there for a limited amount of time, but they can be in various surfaces for a longer or a shorter period of time. But the point is that if I am infected and I shed viral particles towards this particular surface, and somebody else comes after me and touches this surface, and by touching that surface, it's going to now have a smear of those viral particles in the hand, for example. And if that person now involuntarily or without thinking about it touches his face and it touches the mouth or the nose or the eyes, those viral particles now can enter in the body of that other individual and can infect that other individual. So this is how this source of infection happens. So the solution for this source of infection are very straightforward. We could and we should disinfect surfaces, but very importantly, besides avoiding touching our faces so that we avoid touching the route of entry of the virus into our bodies, which is either the mouth or the nose or the eyes, besides avoiding touching our faces, we can also wash our hands, and we should be washing our hands with soap. That is a very efficient, soap is a very efficient agent to destroy the virus. And then once the virus is destroyed, the virus is not infectious anymore. If we don't have soap at hand, we can use also alcohol-based hand sanitizer, which it does the same trick. It kills the virus the same way. So let's talk now about this other major group of infections, which would be the infections that are originated by the people that are already symptomatic with COVID-19. All right, so sometimes the symptoms for COVID-19 are very obvious, like it could be fever or coughing or being fatigued, etc., etc. But sometimes there is a whole plethora of other symptoms that COVID-19 can be manifesting with, right? Not everybody would have the same pattern of symptoms, so sometimes it is not clear by the patient if that individual has been infected or not. But the recommendation is, if somebody suspects by having any sort of symptoms indicated here that this person has been infected with COVID-19, this person should contact with the doctor for further recommendations. But basically, these symptomatic people are by default infectious, which means they can shed the virus and they can infect other people that come in contact with this infectious person. All right, so what these people should do is to verify with PCR testing that they are whether they're infected or not, but in the meantime they should be isolated and they should put into quarantine so that they don't get in contact with other people and other people don't get infected. All right, so it should be relatively straightforward to control the cases of infection when people show symptoms. People with any kind of symptoms should take this very seriously because they could be infecting other people. Now, according to this study and according to the research that is coming up, the main source of COVID-19 infections would come from people that do not show any symptoms of the disease yet. In other words, these people do not know that they have been already infected. We are talking about the asymptomatic carriers. And as you can see, about 50% of all the infections produced by COVID-19 appear to come from this group. So this is where we have to be extremely vigilant to avoid infections. This is the major group of contagion of the disease. All right, so we should pay extra attention to this group. All right, so what are we talking about when we talk about asymptomatic carriers? Well, as I have explained in other videos, when somebody gets infected, this individual is going to first go through a stage of incubation of the virus where the person is still not aware that has been infected. It won't be until this person becomes symptomatic that this person will be aware of the infection. However, in this pre-symptomatic stage of the incubation of the virus, this person is able to shed the virus and therefore is able to infect other people. This is the source of infections by pre-symptomatic. How about the purely asymptomatic people? Well, the purely asymptomatic people represent a very large group of the overall people that get infected with the virus. About 50% of all the cases of infection go through this route in which the individuals that get infected will get into that stage of incubation of the virus, but they will never show any symptoms or whatsoever, to the point that they will never realize that they have been infected with the virus. However, even though they don't know that they have been infected with the virus, they can shed the virus and therefore they can infect other people. All right? So it is especially important to pay attention to prevention of infections by these two major groups of people. The problem is, how do we know that we are not one of those two groups of people? How do we know that we are not infected or that we are an asymptomatic carrier? Or even how do we know that we are not a very, very mildly symptomatic individual? Because mildly symptomatic individuals may have very, very subtle symptoms of the disease and we may not associate them with the disease. So the answer is that we really don't know. We really don't know if we are at any given point in any of these categories. So we perfectly could be an asymptomatic carrier and not be aware of it. All right, so what we should do is to be all very serious about maintaining social distancing and using face masks, because this is the only way that we can prevent infecting other people if we unknowingly are in any of these categories, but we think that we are in this other one, in the category of not being infected. All right, so why social distancing and face masks? Well, very simple, because it has been shown scientifically that it works very well in order to prevent the spread of the virus that produces COVID-19. Well, look at this. I was explaining before that the virus is shed via those tiny respiratory droplets. So if when we talk, when we breathe, when we cough, we project those respiratory droplets around us when we move, right? So we have this radius in which we are contagious, right? So if people come nearby us and we unknowingly are in any of these categories of being an asymptomatic carrier or very, very mildly infected individual, but in both cases we're infectious, what we're gonna do is we're gonna unfortunately infect all these people that come nearby us. But by keeping this social distance of about 6 feet, we will ensure that we dramatically decrease the risk of infection to those other people by our respiratory droplets that contain the virus that we're shedding. All right, so social distancing works pretty well, especially in an outdoors environment. However, social distancing has its own caveats, all right, because it doesn't work very well indoors. I'll show you a couple of examples just to illustrate what I mean when I say that social distancing is not always that effective indoors, and we should be very careful about this, all right? So this is a very well-studied case that was done in China, and it was published, in which this individual right here, sitting in this restaurant, right, spent about an hour and a half dining in this restaurant, and in that process, this individual, that by the way was an asymptomatic carrier of the virus, infected all these other individuals shown in red circles, all right? A total of 9 other individuals were infected by this asymptomatic carrier. And what you can see is that some of these individuals that were infected by these asymptomatic carriers were as far away as almost 14 feet away from the individual that was infected with the virus. 14 feet is much longer than those 6 feet that are the basic social distancing measure. So what happened here? Well, what happened here is this is an enclosed environment. This is an indoors environment, and the air conditioning was on. So the air conditioning was producing this airflow that was making the respiratory droplets of this individual that was infected flying around the room, so that everybody that was in the airflow that the air conditioning was distributing around here got infected. All right, so we should be very careful about indoor spaces. This is yet another striking example of the effect of indoors on the spread of the disease. So this happened in Washington State. This was a choir practice in which all the choir members were very strict about keeping a good social distance between each other, and everybody was feeling perfectly fine coming into this practice, right? However, there was an asymptomatic carrier, somebody that didn't know that was infected but was infected already and was infectious. He was shedding the virus just by talking, just by breathing, but singing apparently was propelling those air droplets, those microscopic air droplets that are carrying the virus, even farther away. So out of the 60 choir members that were rehearsing that day for about 2.5 hours in this indoors space, 45 of them got infected, and 2 of them unfortunately ended up dying out of COVID-19. So you can see the social distancing is not always enough, especially, and I emphasize that, especially indoors. All right, and why does it outside works better when it comes to social distancing? Because it's a completely different environment. There is more ventilation, and the ventilation helps dissipating those air droplets in which a virus is traveling, so they will just go out of your way faster. And also the now hotter, more humid conditions of the summer with more UV light coming from the sun are not conditions that the virus likes. So the virus seems to disintegrate faster in this outdoors environment, where the constant conditions of an indoors environment are better for the survival of the virus. Now, because social distancing is not enough, we should everyone, use face masks, especially indoors, all right? Especially indoors where the risk of contagion is greater. And why everyone? Because anyone, as I said before, could be in either of these categories thinking that we were perfectly fine. We could be an asymptomatic carrier, or we could be in the category of somebody that is showing symptoms, but we don't associate those as symptoms of the disease because they're very, very, very mild. All right? Because anybody can be in these categories. We should all think of ourselves as potentially infectious individuals. Right? And why face masks? Why are they so useful? Well, what face masks do, and this is important to understand, what face masks do is to prevent the spread of the virus. Imagine that we were infected with the virus, and remember, we don't know if we are infected or not. We don't know if we are an asymptomatic carrier or not. If we are an asymptomatic carrier and we are shedding the virus through our nose or through our mouth when we breathe and when we talk, etc., by having a face mask on, we have a filter that actually prevents that those viral particles go into the outside world, all right? And they stayed in the cloth barrier. Now, please, if you are using a face mask, if you made the effort of providing a face mask for yourself, if you made the effort of wearing a face mask, and now you are letting your nose out of your face masks, I have to break the news for you. Your face masks is now completely useless, because you will be shedding, if you're infected, you will be shedding viral particles through your nose. So please, if you're wearing a face mask, and you should be wearing a face mask, cover your nose, otherwise it's totally useless. All right? Now, face masks are not only going to prevent the viral particle spread, but they can, to a minor, and I insist, to a minor extent, prevent the infection of that person that is wearing the face mask. All right, but face masks are not that efficient doing this. Face masks are particularly efficient in preventing the viral particle spread. I want you to appreciate that every time that you breathe, every time that you talk, look at this individual on the left, every time that you breathe, every time that you talk, you are shedding those viral particles if you are infected. And those viral particles are going to travel in those droplets, micro droplets of saliva that you are generating. All right? By having a face mask, you can see that by having a face mask, you are blocking the exit of those viral particles, and therefore you are preventing viral particle spread. So basically, you could represent it like this. If you don't wear a face mask, on the left, you can see the cartoon that if you're not wearing a face mask, you are spreading those droplets into the air that contain the virus. If you have a face mask, you're doing an amazingly good job in retaining those droplets inside your face mask, and only a very tiny portion of them could be exiting your face mask. All right? So again, if you are unknowingly infected and you don't wear a face mask, you would be infecting anybody that is nearby you. If you have a face mask, you are gonna dramatically decrease the risk of infection. Dramatically, but not completely. Why? Because no mask has 100% filtration efficiency. All right? Not even the best masks in the market will have a 100% filtration efficiency. So the best we can do is to, at any point, use social distancing together with the use of a face mask, especially if we are in an indoors environment. This would be the most effective intervention that we can do to prevent the spread of the virus. So in this video, we have talked about how new COVID-19 outbreaks are possible, so we need to do all we can to avoid that these outbreaks happen. And how do we do that? By avoiding that we get infected ourselves. Alright, so the best ways to prevent infection at personal level are to use face masks in combination with social distancing, and this is the most effective way that we can do to avoid the spread of the infection. And also, we have talked about how indoors versus outdoors. Indoors poses a far bigger risk when it comes to infection than outdoors activities, especially during the summer weather.